Hello, everybody, and welcome to another Crowdsourcing Sustainability Podcast. My name's Ryan Hagan, and I'll be your host alongside Rachel Taylor.
Hi, everyone.
And today we are lucky to be joined by Bill McKibben. Bill is one of the most influential climate activists in the world. He's an author and a journalist who has been thinking about, writing about, and acting on climate change for over 30 years. In 1988, he wrote The End of Nature, which was the first book on global warming for a general audience. In 2008, Bill co-founded the worldwide 350.org climate movement. And most recently, he started Third Act, which is a nonprofit specifically for Americans over the age of 60. And I'm just going to wrap up the intro here because he really has too many awards and achievements to list all of them. So, Bill, welcome, and thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Well, Ryan, Rachel, what a pleasure to get to be with you.
Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, we are really excited and thought the best use of our time would be to have you share kind of your 30,000-foot view with us on the past, present, and future. So, like, how did we get here? Where are we right now? And, what do we need to invest our time and energy into going forward to really co-create the best future possible? But as with all our guests, I'd love to start with you and your story. So when did you start caring about climate and why? And, what was your thought process like at this time?
Sure. I did not begin as a climate advocate because there weren't any. I wrote the first book about what we now call climate change, what we then called the greenhouse effect, a book called The End of Nature back in 1989. So I was, 27 when I wrote it and 28 when it came out, first serialized in the New Yorker, where in those days I worked. It was it was a successful book. I think it's out in 24 languages probably, and it was a bestseller all over the place. But for me, it was the beginning of a life's entrapment in this field, because it was clear to me from the very beginning that this was the biggest story in not only of the moment, but probably of human history. And it was also clear to me as I was writing The End of Nature that I wasn't quite the dispassionate journalist that, at least in those days, one was supposed to be. Like, I actually cared whether or not we were going to, overheat the planet and wreck it. And so I at first, though, and it really took me too long to figure this out. At first, I thought my job was simply to keep writing more books and articles, and I wrote an awful lot of them over the next 10 years. There was a period of time when, if there was a big article about climate change in the English-speaking press, there was about a 70% chance it was written by me. And, that was dumb. And I'm very grateful for the huge number of journalists now in this field. But I struggled under the impression, I guess, that we were trying to win the argument. And that once we'd won the argument about climate change, that our leaders would then do the right thing, and on we would go. And it took me about 10 years to figure out that we had won the argument. There was no longer the slightest doubt in the scientific community about what was going on. We were just losing the fight, because the fight wasn't about data and reason and evidence. The fight was about what fights are normally about, which is money and power. And the fossil fuel industry had so much money and hence so much political power that they were quite able to lose the argument, but go on keeping their business model expanding year after year after year. So at some point, sort of in the early aughts, I guess, it became clear to me that we were going to have to try and match their power. We weren't going to do it, obviously, with money. Exxon just made $20 billion last quarter. we were going to have to do it, with the only other kind of currency that mattered, bodies, building movements. And so that's what we set out to do, at first having no idea what we were doing. I mean, I founded 350.org with 7 college students here at Middlebury in Vermont. And I think partly because of beginner's luck, and partly because we didn't know any better, and partly because there was an unfilled kind of ecological niche, we were pretty successful right off. Within a year, we'd coordinated our first big global day of action, which had 5,100 demonstrations in 181 countries. It was a kind of, in 2009, a kind of coming out party for the global climate movement. And ever since then, those movements have kept building to the point where they're now able to kind of match the power of the fossil fuel industry to influence events. Hence, the by the skin of our teeth, 51 votes to 50 passage in the Senate of an actual climate bill, 34 years after I wrote that first book and after Jim Hansen testified before Congress for the first time that climate change was real.
That is crazy.
Wow. Yeah. What a journey you've been on. And so then in your most recent book, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon, a graying American looks back at his suburban boyhood and wonders what the hell happened. Title. One of the things you wrote in that book is that the choices that we made in those years around 1980 will turn out to be more important than any choices that any nation ever made. And so I'd love if you could just frame that up a bit for us, and what were those choices and why were they so important? And also, what parallels are you maybe seeing today, and what can we kind of learn from that and hopefully do differently?
Rachel, absolutely. I do think that the most important election of my lifetime was the election in 1980 when Ronald Reagan beat Jimmy Carter. And I think in the biggest terms, and this is the kind of the point of this most recent book, it was the moment at which we switched visions for America. Coming out of the Depression and the Second World War, I think Americans had conceived that we were engaged in a kind of group project of making America a better place. Fitful, traumatic, filled with dissent and whatever, but on the track towards what LBJ described as a great society, or Dr. King as a beloved community, or whatever. That switched in 1980. We elected Ronald Reagan, and with him an insistence that, as he always put it, government, just government being the word for all of us working together on a project, government is the problem, not the solution. And that the solution lay in individuals trying to make themselves wealthy and in markets solving the world's problems. This hasn't worked out well. Markets left to themselves have managed to melt most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic. Markets have led to a degree of inequality so remarkable that life expectancy in the U.S. is now dropping dramatically as people in the lower end die deaths of despair. And in the case of energy and climate in particular, the choice was stark and pretty remarkable. Jimmy Carter, running for office after a decade that saw 2 energy crises, wanted to put the full power of the federal government behind the search for renewable energy. In his last budget, the one that he would have, had he been reelected in 1980, would have gone into effect, he put aside money enough to put America on a course to getting 20% of its energy from renewable sources, from solar energy in particular, by the year 2000. Had we done that, we would be in an entirely different place now. We would not have solved climate change, but we would be well on the way, among other things, because we would have had large amounts of renewable energy and technology available in the period when China was rapidly industrializing, and they could have skipped much of the coal era like that. Instead, Ronald Reagan announced that the solution to our problems was to drill everywhere, and he, metaphorically anyway, climbed up on the White House roof and took down the solar panels that Jimmy Carter had put up there a couple of years before. And really, for 40 years, the federal government and was out of the business of helping deal with questions around energy and what quickly turned into questions around climate. And more than anything else, I think that decision explains the failure we found ourselves in. Now, we're finally at a moment when Joe Biden was kind of enacting Bernie Sanders' agenda in many ways, is doing what he can to put us back in a different place. I think that things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which we called the Build Back Better Act for a long time, in which Joe Manchin slimmed down in bad ways, nonetheless is an effort not to recreate the Obama or even the Clinton presidencies, but really the biggest effort to put the federal government at work on a problem since LBJ and the Great Society programs of the 1960s. So ambitious and important, and he should get credit for that. And it's not at all clear that it's going to work, to the degree that we lose control of Congress. It'll make it much more difficult. And even with control of Congress, the fact that we now have an insanely right-wing Supreme Court makes it difficult to imagine the sort of set of policy things that might pass muster with these guys going forward.
Yeah, we're going to learn a lot in the next week or so.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
Yeah.
I was going to ask another thing you wrote about in this awesome book, and we'll link to it. I think, if people like this conversation, they'll love the book. I thought it was fantastic. But you wrote that there's a non-trivial chance that our civilizations could simply collapse in the decades ahead. And that line really struck me because it's something I'm grappling with, trying to wrap my head around right now. And I think it's a hard thing to talk about and kind of, foresee. So I'd love for you to just elaborate on what you mean by that and how you're defining collapse.
Sure.
What you think that looks like and for who.
Well, so there's obviously going to be enormous stress on our systems, because that's what happens when you introduce a lot more energy into a closed system. At the moment, the extra heat we trap each day in the planet's atmosphere because of the carbon we've put up there is the heat equivalent each day of about 500,000 Hiroshima-sized bombs. So, that when you think about it in units like that, you get a sense of how we've managed to melt most of the sea ice in the summer Arctic, or start the oceans rising, or fundamentally destabilize the planet's hydrological cycle, the way that water moves around the Earth. So, warm air holds more water than cold. That's the essential fact of this century. It means that in arid areas, we're seeing rapid onset of drought and then fire. And in wet areas, we're seeing downpours like we've never seen before. I mean, as we talk, there's still tens of millions of people displaced in Pakistan from the worst floods since Noah, the kind of flooding you can only have when you've changed the way the atmosphere holds water. So these things, and these are the effects we're seeing at 1 degree Celsius. We're headed, unless we move very quickly, to something closer to 3 degrees Celsius by the time you guys are, as old as I am. And 3 degrees Celsius probably produces so much violent flux and chaos that it will be difficult to maintain, I think, civilizations like the ones that we've built. The UN estimates we could easily see 1 billion climate refugees in that scenario, and some of the estimates are higher than that. 1 billion people on the move around the planet is just utter recipe for chaos of all kinds. It was about 1 million refugees from the Syrian civil war, itself caused in part by the deepest drought in what we used to call the Fertile Crescent, that discombobulated European politics to the point where we had the rise of far-right parties, and you've seen the effects of immigration on the political debate in this country more than anything else. It's the issue that Trump took advantage of to try and to take over our democracy. So the kind of chaos that comes with people in transition and migrating everywhere, with cascading losses of value in people's homes and things as seas rise, and with the increasing difficulty in growing enough food to feed everybody on a planet where alternating drought and flood make agriculture more difficult, are all things that have in the past led to civilizational collapses, and certainly could here, especially since I think we begin this process with our governmental systems in a state of close to dysfunction anyway.
Yeah.
And so the good news is that we have a pretty strong sense of how we prevent some of that and of how we ground the whatever comes after in a better place. And that something is renewable energy dispersed and scaled across the planet. Thanks to the great work of scientists and engineers who have made renewable energy 90% cheaper in the last decade, it's completely plausible to imagine a very different system than the one we live under now, and one that works better in all kinds of ways. The fact that pointing a sheet of glass at the sun is now the cheapest way to produce energy on the planet should rewrite an awful lot of assumptions that we have, and make quick change possible, not only to save the climate, not only to save the 9 million people a year, about 1 death in 5 that come from breathing the combustion byproducts of fossil fuel, but also to reorient some of our political problems around the planet. Look, we're having to spend the year living under the shadow of nuclear war for the first time in a long time because Vladimir Putin makes enough money selling oil and gas to allow him to invade Ukraine. And he has enough control over oil and gas to intimidate Germany and France into cowering before him at the threat of turning off the tap. If we could move past that world, and we could move past that world quite quickly, we'd be in a place where those things would start to shift. Vladimir Putin, nor the King of Saudi Arabia, nor the Koch brothers can turn off the sun or, interdict the wind or whatever. So the possibilities of a working world seem tantalizingly close. What stands between us and that is the continued power of the fossil fuel industry and their insistence on maintaining their business model, which, if you think about it, is essentially just lighting things on fire. And that's how they've made their fortune, but we don't need that anymore. We're at the point where all of a sudden we could realistically end the 700,000 year human habit of combustion. It's served us well, but now it's serving us badly. And we don't need it. The good Lord was kind enough to hang a large ball of burning gas 93 million miles away. And now we know how to take full advantage. We capture its rays with photovoltaic panels. We take advantage of the fact that it differentially heats the earth, producing wind to capture on turbines. We don't need to be burning stuff anymore. The only people who need to be burning stuff are people who own coal mines and oil and gas wells. And it's their political power and their ability to continue exerting that political power that may fatally slow down this transition to a better world. It's not that the final outcome here is obvious. 75 years from now, 50 years from now, we will run the world on sun and wind because it's very close to free. But if it takes us anything like 50 years to get there, the world that we run on sun and wind will be a broken world. So that's why the urgency of the transition seems so crucial above all. Pace.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'd love to, dig in a little bit more to what you're talking about in terms of like this possibility of a really different future, right? And so, we know so much of what that future looks like depends on what we do right now, like you're saying. And so I'd love to know, like, what is your theory of change and what do you feel like are the biggest levers that we need to be pulling on now? And what's kind of the future that you see as possible if we do that?
Sure. So theory of change continues to be weaken the relative position of the fossil fuel industry against the forces of science, engineering, and basic reason. And that happens in many ways, some of them political through Washington. Truthfully, my guess is that the Inflation Reduction Act is the last big thing we're going to get out of Washington for quite a while. Even if the midterms don't go disastrously, I doubt that Congress is going to reload and give us another big bill anytime soon. A lot of the action, political action, therefore, shifting to state and local levels, and some of that's really important. I mean, California is the 5th largest economy in the world. It's Germany. And so it's big enough to, with smart policy making, drag the rest of the country, some of the world behind in some of the same way. So we do lots of work around that. But the other place where we've really focused is trying to interrupt the flow of capital to the fossil fuel industry. The first effort around this was this vast divestment campaign. It's turned into the largest anti-corporate campaign in history. We're at about $40 trillion now in endowments and portfolios, pension funds that have sold their coal or oil or gas stock. And that's been very helpful. Shell Oil, in its annual report a couple of years ago, said divestment had become a material risk to its business, which is good because their business is a material risk to life on planet Earth. Now we're expanding this focus to also go after the financial institutions that provide the capital on which the fossil fuel industry depends. About 90% of their capital now comes directly from bank loans or from banks issuing corporate debt. And it's heavily concentrated in a few players. The 4 big American banks, Chase, Citi, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, are also the 4 biggest lenders to the fossil fuel industry in the world. They've lent them $1 trillion since the Paris Climate Accord was signed. They didn't need Donald Trump sabotaging the thing. They were completely happy to do it themselves. So we're doing our best to start taking them on. My last trip out before the pandemic was getting arrested in the lobby of the Chase Bank nearest the nation's capital at the beginning of a campaign somewhat interrupted by the pandemic, but effective in certain ways. These banks have now signed onto series of declarations about their intense desire to go net zero by the middle of the century. They don't really seem to mean it, and they're continuing to lend large sums of money. So we're continuing to go after them. And in fact, just announcing a big day of action for the spring that'll have people inside and outside banks, people cutting up credit cards, people making trying to drive home the idea that this is a really important target. There's two levers big enough to matter at this point. One of them is marked politics. I think we've pulled it pretty much to the floor, and we've finally gotten some action. The Inflation Reduction Act is a good thing, but highly imperfect and limited. The other lever is marked money, and I think we need to tug harder on it now.
Yeah, and when you're talking about these campaigns, you're talking about Third Act, right? So do you want to give us a little bit of background and just information
Sure.
what Third Act is and where it's
So actually, these campaigns against the banks and stuff are pretty broad-based, and there's a coalition called Stop the Money Pipeline that's been helped form, that's been playing a big role. But yes, on this latest banks work, Third Act is taking some of the lead. Third Act is a new operation about a year old, aimed at people like me over the age of 60. So you can tell your grandparents about it. It's an effort to mobilize older Americans in around action on the climate and action to defend the democracy too, because these seem to me deeply linked, and they seem to me the two fundamental crises of the moment. Look, there's been a widespread belief that people become more conservative as they age. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the reasons that there hasn't been much effort to organize this age group. But truthfully, I think at this point in history, it's not true. We've had extraordinary success in this first year, tens of thousands of people rolling in to help. And the reason, I think, is that if you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s now, the first act of your life, you were around to either participate in or bear witness to this period of very rapid social, political, cultural transformation. Look at this was the period when we started taking women seriously as actors in public life, when the apex of the civil rights movement, and the first Earth Day and the birth of modern environmentalism, If you doubt the importance of these years, look at the things that the Supreme Court, in its retrograde way, took aim at this summer. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Gun Control Act of 1968, the Clean Air Act of 1971, and Roe v. Wade 1973. These were the things that we fought for and won at an earlier moment, and so, it's a fair criticism, the kind of okay boomer criticism of this demographic, that with plenty of exceptions, our second act may have been more devoted to consumerism than to citizenship. Fair enough, but that water's under the bridge, and now people emerge into their third act with lots of skills, lots of resources. Fair or not, boomers and the silent generation above them have about 70% of the country's financial assets, compared with about 5% for millennials. So if you want to go after Wall Street, it's a helpful cohort. People also have time, which they may not have had before, and they have kids and grandkids, which take this abstract concept of legacy and make it very concrete. Your legacy is the world you leave behind for the people you love the most. And at the moment, we're on the edge of leaving behind a world worse than we found it. So people have joined in, and it's not that we need to lead this fight. We're completely happy to back up the extraordinary work being done by young people, be it the Sunrise Movement, be it Fridays for the Future, and Greta and her wonderful colleagues around the world, on and on and on. But it's been really fun to get to do that. So, for instance, I was just down in Brooklyn for these protests outside banks a week or so ago, and this big march, all kinds of people. And, the 100 high school kids who were there were at the front because they're somewhat sprier, but behind them, big crowd of us third actors with a big banner that said, fossils against fossil fuels. Someone had a t-shirt, new third act t-shirt that said, damn right, we're cranky. And, so we're coming at it, I hope, in the right spirit. And I do think that this is an under-organized group of people that may play a really significant role. Look, there's 70 million people over the age of 60 in this country. 10,000 more every day, which is more people than are being born every day in this country. And they're not only a lot of us, we punch way above our weight. Because we all vote. There is no known way of preventing old people from voting. And so, it really would make sense to organize as best we can among this group too.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you for that work. I'm sure we have people listening who would be interested in joining up. So I'll share links for that as well. We're running low on time, which I knew we would. So I'm hoping to do a little rapid fire to get through the rest here if we can. So just real quick initial thoughts on all this stuff, but you mentioned the importance of voting and sort of the threats to democracy as, that's one of the crises, twin crises right now. How do you think about that, and what can ordinary people do about it? Because I'm also extremely concerned about what's going on and feel like, even though it's kind of in the news, it doesn't seem like we're taking it seriously enough.
Partly we're not taking it seriously enough because it's so strange. Literally, though I lived through traumas like Watergate, it never would have occurred to me, or I think to almost anyone else, that we would reach the point where, gangs of people were storming the nation's capital and killing police officers in order to stop the counting of votes. So there's still something that's hard for us to emotionally and intellectually grapple with, the depths to which we have quickly descended. But there's no cure for it but organizing, winning elections, getting lots and lots of people engaged. And so, at Third Act, we're sending out, we've sent out like 1 million postcards that people have patiently written to voters around the country, made endless phone calls. We've got all sorts of people signed up as poll watchers and election watchers to keep, various militias and goons and whatever at some kind of bay. It should not take this kind of work, but it does. And so it's a key part, no matter what thing you care about on this planet, it's a key part of is trying to make it happen.
Yeah, awesome. And what do you see as the keys to effective organizing? Like what do people who have never been involved in organizing before, what do you think they should know?
Well, organizing, you have a series of fights. Humans are attracted to battles. That's sort of how we stage, how we understand the world in political terms often. And so you need to often create a series of battles. We fought hard against the Keystone Pipeline, and that became the first big loss for the oil industry. And it spurred people to fight 1,000 other fights against every new pipeline and coal terminal and frack well and whatever. Each of those fights is important in and of itself, Ryan, but they're also important because fighting them, win or lose, helps shift the zeitgeist. And on these huge questions, that's really what I think activists are working for more than anything else, shifting people's sense of what's normal and natural and obvious. And we've done a lot of that work. The polling data shows Americans in much larger numbers, 70%, concerned about climate change, understanding that we need a problem. If we had a functioning democracy, a better functioning democracy, that 70% would be more than enough to get us what we need to do. At the moment, we're kind of lacking some of the transmission that takes public opinion and turns it into policy. But certainly for organizers, that's a huge part of it.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, two more questions for you. The first is, what's your sense, like you just mentioned shifting the culture, the zeitgeist, what's your sense of how best to do that as an average person? And then I guess more specifically, I'm curious, you're a man of faith. Like, what is the role of religious communities right now? Because they seem like they could have a very powerful role to play.
Well, second first, religious communities are playing an increasingly powerful role. Not all of them. I mean, evangelical Christianity has decided it wants to be a subset of the Republican Party, and hence an ally of big oil. But many other traditions are making important steps, including the biggest religious grouping in America, Roman Catholics. I mean, Pope Francis and his encyclical Laudato Si is as important a piece of work on climate change as there has been this millennium. And so they play an increasingly crucial role. And for people who won't take the time to read that remarkable document, there's also a movie that came out in the last month or so called The Letter, about it, that's on the streaming services and easy to find. So as for how individuals make a difference, that's the key question. I mean, I'm glad that I'm live in a house that I've covered with solar panels, and I'm glad that they're connected to the EV and the garage and to the magnetic induction cooktop and to the air source heat pump and to all the other wonderful technologies that we have. But I do not try to fool myself that this is how we're going to solve this crisis. We've waited too long to do it just one household at a time. You can't make the math add up fast enough without making more of the kind of changes that we got in the IRA that start providing money and, to make this stuff happen on a big scale. So the most important thing an individual can do is be a little less of an individual, to join together with others in movements large enough to make change. And this is why we built 350.org or Third Act or the Sunrise Movement or Fridays for the Future or the Sierra Club or whatever it is that you're inclined to, so that we can aggregate people and get back to, and this links back to the very beginning of this conversation, get back to the work of having a kind of group project of making the country and the planet a workable, livable place. That's got to be a group project. It can't be done just by each of us working by ourselves. And so, be a little less of an individual. That's as good a piece of advice as I know on how to become an effective agent of change.
Love that.
That's wonderful. That makes me think of, there's a quote by Lynn Margolis who says, life didn't take over the planet through combat, but through collaboration.
There you go.
Like, it's actually in our nature.
In this case, we need to collaborate to engage in a little bit of combat with the and chevrons of the world.
Yes.
But yes, I think the point is well taken.
Amazing. Well, that is the perfect note to end on. Do you have any final thoughts or calls to action you want to share with people, Bill? We'll be sharing the links to Third Act and some of the other things we referenced today. I'm excited to also find that video. I have not heard of that, so that'll be good to watch.
Just the only thought is that everyone listening to this is going to live more than long enough to see the outcome. What happens in the next 6, 7, 8, 9 years will determine how far down this path of increased temperature we go. Because on climate change is not like other political problems in that it is a timed test. If you don't solve healthcare in the next 10 years, well, a lot of people die and go bankrupt, but it doesn't make it harder to solve it after that. If you don't solve climate change, once you've melted the Arctic, it's not like someone has a good plan for how you freeze it back up again. Winning slowly on climate is just a different way of losing. So our job is to act in ways that reflect that physical urgency. Our adversary here, in some sense, is physics. And physics doesn't negotiate, it doesn't compromise, it doesn't meet you in the middle, it just does what it's going to do. So we better do what it is telling us it needs for us to do. And we have the tools to do it now. Now we need the will to make use of those tools in the face of vested interest. Let us hope that we can assemble that will.
Hear, hear.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you guys so much, and you have a good day, and thank you for all your work. It's important and much appreciated.
Same to you, Bill. Thank you. Take care.